Hello everyone, my name is Dr. J.P. Lindstroth. I want to thank Patricia Trejo and Brian Knowles for inviting me to speak at the 8th Annual Hispanic and Latino Studies Summer Institute for the Palm Beach County School District. Just to give you a brief biography about myself, I'm a social science teacher at Royal Palm Beach High School. I teach advanced placement, world history, honors world history, and world history. I've also taught ACE US history. And I have a PhD from the University of Oxford in the United Kingdom, a PhD in social and cultural anthropology. I have been invited here today to speak about the social strategies that the urban Amerindians I studied in Brazil use to overcome racism, and how that may apply to multicultural education here in the United States, and in relation to theories of multicultural education as promoted by James Banks. I have been in teaching in education, primarily in higher education, for the past 23 years. I am fluent in both Spanish and Portuguese. And in 2009, I was awarded a Fulbright foreign scholarship to be a visiting professor at the Universidade Federal do Amazonas, or UFAM, where I also conducted an anthropological field study on different urban Amerindian populations, namely the Apurina, Cambeba, Kokama, Munduruku, Mura, Satay Mwana, Chukuna, and Tucano Indians. The city of Manaus, where I was a visiting professor and conducted my anthropological field research, is a city of more than 2 million people in the middle of the Brazilian Amazon. At the moment, I'm also working on and writing my fourth book, Crises Beyond Nationalities, Racism, Immigration, Genocide, and Peace. And so that's a little bit about myself. When thinking about the issue of racism in regard to the indigenous people I studied, have to really put it into context with Brazilian society, and understanding how Brazilians understand ethnicity, which is very different than as the concept is understood in the United States. Manaus is a city of predominantly people with indigenous heritage, and even mixed heritage, what Brazilians call misturados, who have indigenous heritage along with Caucasian heritage. Another ethnic term that we don't use in the United States, which they use, is known as caboclo, which is somebody of indigenous descent and Caucasian heritage. The majority of the population would consider themselves to be white or brancos. However, after more careful consideration, realized that the majority of the population does actually have indigenous descent. So why are they negating their Native American heritage? And the reason is because that people in Brazil regard Indians, or native peoples, Amerindians, as kind of the lowest class of ethnicity in the country. Indians are truly a minority in Brazil. There's only roughly about 1 million indigenous people in Brazil, or 0.3% of the population. And in Manaus, the city of over 2 million people, there are approximately 50,000 or more urban Amerindians living in the city. So when we think about this notion of multicultural education as promoted by James Banks, multicultural education, an idea or concept, an education reform movement and a process is what he calls multicultural education. And also promoting the idea, according to him, that all students should have an equal opportunity to learn in school. The Brazilian native peoples that I studied in Brazil, their children were stigmatized in the school system. So the urban Amerindian peoples had to figure out a way to make certain that their children were not discriminated against. And so this talk, this lecture, if you will, is to explain those strategies that they used to overcome the racism that they faced by the larger society. I should also say that the native peoples in Brazil, at least the urban Amerindians that I work with and engaged with in Manaus, especially the Satay Mwana people, the week before I arrived, their schoolhouse in the community where they lived was burned down by neighbors as an act of discrimination and racism against them because they did not want native peoples, Indians, in their neighborhood. So going back to James Banks states that multicultural education focuses on how race, ethnicity, class, gender, religion, language, and sexual orientation, whether lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender identity, or what's called LGBT identity, influence student learning and behavior, and how we as educators can and may incorporate an understanding of ethnicity and a better understanding of ethnicity and race, and how we incorporate those varying views into the educational process, or what's considered multicultural education. I should also state, or also say, that back in 2005, when I was a professor at Nova Southeastern University, I was co-awarded, along with other university colleagues, a Alexander von Humboldt grant to study ethnic minorities here in South Florida, namely Cuban Americans, Haitian Americans, and Guatemalan Mayan Americans, Guatemalan Mayan immigrants. And that resulted in varying articles co-written with colleagues, university colleagues, as well as graduate students. It also resulted in my own article called Mayan Cognition. Hello, everybody. Just continuing from what I was saying before. I was co-awarded along with colleagues an Alexander von Humboldt grant to study Haitians, Cuban Americans, Haitian Americans, and Guatemala Mayan Americans immigrants in South Florida. And it resulted in various publications, including publication of my own in the anthropology journal History and Anthropology. The title of the article is Mayan Cognition, Memory, and Trauma. And the reason why I wanted to bring up that research today is because it applies to not only the native peoples that I studied in Brazil, but also an understanding of discrimination and racism in relation to having a better understanding of multicultural education. And I just wanted to touch upon the brief theoretical aspects of that article. Part of the article was analyzing the controversy of the Nobel laureate, Rigoberta Menchu tomb. Some of the Guatemala Mayan immigrants who arrived in South Florida in Palm Beach County, at least the earliest immigrants, were survivors of a genocide in Guatemala that happened in the early 1980s, 1980, 1982. A genocide that mostly targeted Mayan Indians in the highlands of Guatemala. A genocide that has been described as mostly from the violent actions of the Guatemalan military against these groups, where 200,000 people were killed or just disappeared. In my article, Mayan Cognition, Memory, and Trauma, in the Journal of History and Anthropology, I discuss an anthropological controversy over the Nobel laureate Rigoberta Menchu tomb. She won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1992 for her work with the Mayan Indians in her country, home country, Brazil. And she wrote an autobiography which has been really important in multicultural education. The autobiography, which is taught at many high schools and in many universities. I, Rigoberta Menchu, an Indian woman in Guatemala, first published in 1983 in France, later the English translation in 1984. And it was the recollection of her life that another anthropologist questioned whether or not the memories that she expressed in her autobiography were true or were exaggerated. And that's an important point because I think it's an important point about notions of memory, how memory is constructed, how memory may be constructed from an ethnic and cultural point of view. And so anthropologists who were discussing this controversy about the veracity of Menchu tomb and her autobiography talked about how indigenous memory construction is quite different than we have in the West, in Western Europe, for example. And indigenous memory, in many ways, can be collective memory, how a village remembers the genocide in Guatemala, for example. And what does that mean as far as genocidal memory is concerned, or reconstructing the atrocities that were in fact committed in Guatemala in the early 1980s, 1980, 1982. The Civil War in Guatemala lasting really from the 1960s until 1996. And so in the article, Mayan Cognition, Memory and Trauma, my article, I talked about this idea of exaggeration. The idea that, well, memories of genocide may have been exaggerated, or maybe the facts weren't altogether true. As a colleague who we talked about her work, who's written on the Holocaust, even if the memories were partially true, doesn't make them any less true. In other words, memories of genocide, if they're collective memories, of course they're not going to have maybe necessarily the details right. But those memories of genocide are collective memories. And what I found is that when I, back in 1990, when I collected depositions for people to get green cards to stay in the United States, there were definitely exaggerated memories of genocide that I translated into English. Many of the memories were the same, but the atrocities happened in many villages in northern Guatemala in the highlands. And so even if we talk about even if memories are exaggerated, it doesn't make them any less true. So that was part of the article. And then the other aspect of the article was talking about memories of racism, memories of discrimination. And the memories of racism and discrimination that the Guatemala Mayas experienced in South Florida. We know that the Mayan immigrants are Indians, native peoples in Guatemala, from varying groups who speak different native languages, whether it's Canjobal or Mam or Quiché, or those groups are discriminated against by the Ladino, or predominantly so-called white Hispanic population in Guatemala. And the reason why I bring that up is because my analysis, my theory in the article, my different theories, led me to a cognitive understanding of racism and discrimination. And I think that's important to bring up today in my talk, in my lecture. There are two forms of memory and trauma that I pointed out. And this notion of memory and trauma is quite important in terms of not only in understanding memories of genocide, but also understanding memories of racism. And so what do I mean by that? Well, we can think of memory and trauma in terms of time. And we can think of time being divided into synchronic episodes or specific episodes in time when individuals remember certain and specific episodes of racist discrimination. And we can think of racism and trauma as occurring over long periods of time, or what I call diachronic trauma. So an individual who has experienced racism can have both. They can have memories of specific times when they were discriminated against, and racism itself can be an occurrence over a long period of time, which leads to an understanding of structural violence. And by structural violence, I'm also expanding upon the term as understood by the anthropologist Nancy Shepherd Hughes and the French sociologist and anthropologist Pierre Bourdieu. So structural violence consists of those oppressive structures in society which, so as I was discussing, understanding racism from my theoretical perspective as related to trauma and memories of trauma, memories of racism, can be analyzed in terms of time, whether we're talking about specific episodes or synchronic trauma, specific episodes of racism, or diachronic trauma, diachronic racism experienced over long periods of time. And an individual may have both. They may have synchronic memories, specific episodes, but they may experience racism for a long period of time. And so, what I also want to relate to is this notion of structural violence. Structural violence, as I was talking about, expanding upon the theoretical ideas of Nancy Shepherd Hughes, an anthropologist at Berkeley, and the now late Pierre Bourdieu, who's a sociologist and anthropologist in France, who was. The idea of structural violence is that understanding how the structures in society keep particular people from having a proper education, from having jobs, from having housing, because of their ethnicity or race or their religious point of view or their religious views, or maybe because of their sexual orientation. So what are the barriers and structures in society which are oppressive and keep people from, let's say, having normal lives, as in comparison to perhaps Caucasian white majorities? And so that was part of the theoretical discussion in the article Mayan Cognition and Trauma. In a future book on my Fulbright research in Brazil, I'll be expanding upon these ideas of racism against the Amerindian peoples that I studied and I mentioned earlier. So let's return to James Banks's notions of multicultural education. And what I'd like to do is expand upon, or just discuss briefly, what he considers level 3 and level 4 of multicultural education. When he talks about level 3, transformative curriculum, and I'm going to, basically paraphrasing and quoting what he's saying, the structures of curriculum is changed to enable students to view concepts, issues, events, and themes from the perspective of a diverse ethnic and cultural groups. Whereas level 4 is what he considers social action. Students make decisions on important social issues and take actions to help solve various themes. I think it's important too to bring up the French philosopher Michel Foucault and his notions of power knowledge. And the reason why Foucault is important is because the idea of knowledge equated with power is very important to, I believe, Banks's concepts of multicultural education and how power knowledge can transform students' lives by empowering them with the knowledge skills to take ideas beyond the classroom and apply it to their everyday lives. So let me then briefly return to the urban Amerindian peoples I studied in Brazil, and specifically one of the groups the group known as who call themselves Satay Mwana, native peoples. They, in their language, Mwana, which is a Tupi, part of the Tupi family, the Satay Mwana is a conflation of two words in the Mwana language. One being fiery caterpillar, kind of the poisonous caterpillars that they identified with, and also Mwana from a talkative parrot. And these are people that are originally from the southern area of Amazonas state in Brazil, in the Amazonia region. They are a people, as I mentioned, who speak part of the Tupi language family. And they are one of the larger indigenous groups in the Amazon, the Brazilian Amazonia. Young men in their society go through what is considered a rite of passage ritual, rite de passage, as Van Gennep would call it. And what are rites of passage rituals? Well, those are the types of rituals, for example, circumcision rites that young men go through from transforming from adolescence into adulthood, to becoming men. So the Satay Mwana people have a unique ritual, which is dancing in place and with other members of their group, male society. And it's called the Tucandera dance. And what these young men do, they wear palm frond gloves with approximately 100, 150 bullet ants. Paraparnara clavata is the Latin family of these ants. Very large stinging ants, and on the stinging scale, some of the worst pain you can endure. But they dance with these stinging ants and are stung for a period of 15, 20 minutes in order to become men in their society. And many indigenous peoples throughout the world have rites of passage rituals. So the young men, adolescents, are expected to undergo this ritual for at least 20 times in their lifetime to become men, and to be eligible to marry within Satay Mwana society. The group that I studied in Manaus, Brazil, were also Seventh-day Adventists, known as Avanchista. And so they had they were Christian beliefs along with their traditional rituals. And what's important, the reason why I bring up their Tucandera dance, which is the Tucandera is actually in their language, the ant that I mentioned, the bullet ant, or the Paraparnara clavata. The reason why I bring that up is that on the Day of the Indian, in Brazil they have a special day, or Day of the Indian, which is a holiday that's recognized throughout Brazil, April 24th. And on this day, native peoples in Manaus, Brazil, would dress up in their traditional Indian native attire, and they would paint themselves with black paint, or genipapo, and the red paint known as urucum from these different plants. And the children would go to school with their native attire, and at the beginning. Okay, thank you. Continuing from what I was saying. earlier. The urban Amerindian people on the Day of the Indian, Dia do Indio, April 24th, would dress in their native attire, paint themselves with the black plant-based paint Genipapo, and urucum, which is the red paste that they would use from the plant urucum. And the children would go to school in their native attire. And at first, when they were doing this, they would be discriminated against. However, one of the Satay Mwana chiefs decided that to make this day important, to invite the families of the children in school to their Amerindian native celebrations in the city. So rather than fight the discrimination at school, they would invite the parents and the children of these white families, brancos, to their native community, where they would show them, the other white families, that about native traditions, native customs, and especially in relation to their group, the Satay Mwana. And so at the Day of the Indian, it's like a 3-day festival where they sell their native jewelry made of Amazonian plants and seeds of different plants, which is very decorative jewelry that they would sell. They would sell traditional food, and they would have the dance, and then they would also simulate the Tucandera dance, which is a sacred ritual, as I mentioned before, a rite of passage for young men to become men, young adolescents to become men in their society. Although in the simulated ritual, they wouldn't, the young person wearing the palm frond gloves they wouldn't have the ants in those gloves. They wouldn't actually go through the excruciating ritual. Because for the Satay Mwana, the ceremony is sacred and is a private matter for that young adolescent to become a man. So how does this relate to multicultural education in the United States? Well, I think clearly when you can engage students from different ethnic and cultural backgrounds, and different religious backgrounds, different points of view. And going back to what James Banks was discussing in terms of transformative curriculum and social action curriculum. So on the one hand, going through the different levels of enabling students to view concepts, issues, and events and themes from a diverse cultural point of view. So perhaps at the transformative curriculum level, maybe you could have a Day of the Indian in school where students would be instructed to bring different native dishes, perhaps after doing some research, or it could be different Hispanic foods related to different cultures and countries around the world. For example, Mexico or Brazil or Peru. And have a curriculum in relation to the food that they might bring to school. In addition to that, aside from level one, which is really explaining famous people from and cultural events in relation to different minority points of view. You have a celebration of ethnicities, which would be perhaps a transformative curriculum. But then at the level 4 level, how do you get students to make important social decisions, take actions, and social themes? And what I thought about in relation to this was really the pandemic that we're experiencing now. As teachers, we're all teaching online and having to adapt our educational process to online education. But I thought, that the pandemic and of the coronavirus, COVID-19, is an opportune time to understanding how the pandemic and this epidemic disease is related and can be related to ethnicity and race, in the sense that how the COVID-19 has affected ethnic minorities in our communities. For example, knowing the fact that that the Hispanic community among the ethnic minorities within the United States has the lowest percentage of people who have health insurance. Also understanding how COVID-19 has adversely affected the African American community. And so why has it affected these minorities within the United States? Well, it's because in many cases, in the African American community and in the Hispanic American community, because of socioeconomic differences or because of the lower socioeconomic status, these people and these minorities aren't in many cases, cannot, quarantine themselves at home. They have to work. And so they have been exposed to COVID-19 by being, in some cases and in many cases, in the service industries. And therefore, because of having forced to work because of having no other economic opportunities to be able to quarantine themselves beyond work, had been overly exposed to COVID-19 by being in the service community industries as one. And so, how can students maybe research this pandemic, COVID-19, in relation to the socioeconomic disparities, what we call public health disparities in the United States? And these are public health issues that are quite important, and that students could maybe research how the disparities in public health and disparities in health affect minority groups such as Hispanic Americans and African Americans in our community and our society. And so even my research in Brazil, among groups who used different social actions, social methods to overcome racism, may be applied to curriculum here in the United States, in Palm Beach County. And so I wanted to, again, emphasize this Foucauldian notion, Michel Foucault, of power knowledge, that knowledge may be used for empowering minority groups and may be used to as part of the multicultural education process. And I want to thank all of you again today for listening to my talk and my lecture on these issues, and wishing you all well through this trying times that we live in now today. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful day.